Usually there's no problem with people hearing me. So, well, it's a real pleasure to introduce Ron Mitchell, a good friend and colleague whose work I've followed for a long time now. He's trained as a political scientist. He's a political science professor at Oregon. He's actually a professor of political science and environmental studies at Oregon. His research looks at what makes environmental treaties effective. And one thing that I think is particularly interesting about Ron's work is that he's combining public policy and political science approaches with empirical approaches to test whether environmental treaties are actually effective or not. So he does deep dives, but also with data. So it's the marriage of empirical analysis with case studies as well. For more than a decade, Ron directed the dissertation initiative for the advancement of climate change research. It was called the Discourse Program that was funded by NSF. And that program helped emerging young scientists who work on climate change develop a communication strategy, but also how do you work together? So this was, I think, for more than a decade, a transformative program that brought scholars from around the country and from different disciplines to work together on climate change issues. Anyhow, so I think that was a pretty effective program. Ron has his PhD in public policy from Harvard, and after he left Harvard, he did a postdoc for a year, and then he's been at University of Oregon since 1993 with a short stint while he did a sabbatical at Stanford in the early 2000s. Early 2000s. For many of you, the students in the room might be very interested in the database that he developed. It's called the International Environmental Agreements Database. It contains all the multilateral environmental treaties, agreements signed. It's an incredible database. I've sent a number of students to use it, lots of data. And so it's an incredible service that he has developed this database and made it publicly available. So Ron's going to talk today about how we can make environmental treaties more effective. Please join me in welcoming Ron.
Thanks, Karen, for that nice introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me to be here. It's very exciting. I know a few students here. One of my students from U of O is here as a master's student now, Lauren Boucher. And it's just exciting to be here. I want to start the talk by just saying my thanks to NSF, who funded this, and for the U of O for a summer research award this past summer. I'd also like to dedicate the lecture to my father-in-law, who was a professor of sociology here at Yale for 3 decades. He passed away a while back, and my mother-in-law is here today, so this is nice for her to be here. So I want to begin by getting you to think about this question. Now, some of you may have preferences about who the next president is. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to make a decision. But let's imagine in the late January of next year, the next president, whoever he or she may be, calls you to ask, what should we change in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement to make it more effective? You all know that these agreements take a while to negotiate, so we got to start thinking about it on day one, right? So that we have a plan by 5 years out when we finally negotiate a new agreement. Luckily, it's going to enter into force Friday. You know, this new agreement is going to enter into force, meaning become legally binding. Those of you who are informed on this stuff realize that legally binding in terms of international law is an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp, Microsoft Works, things like that. So if that's the question, you get the call, what advice do you give? What's your evidence to support it? And how confident are you? Because I think most of us are making it up. All right? I think there's very little evidence-based research to prove that if you added this thing to this treaty, it would make it work better. So how do you decide? So a lot of what I've been working on, and the paper I'm presenting I've been working on for a decade, to give you some sense of what that kind of work involves. It means working for a decade and then having it rejected by the top journal in the field, and you go back to the drawing board one more time. But how do you design research to provide good advice that you would really trust? Because I don't want to be advising people to do treaty. This is the only planet we got. We don't have a planet B. So if we're going to advise them, do this with this treaty, it better be right. So many provisions are claimed as improving effectiveness. You should make the commitments in the Paris Agreement legally binding, the intended nationally determined contributions, how much they're going to reduce. You should require them to make deeper commitments. Everybody should do 10% more than they agree to. You should have sanctions. You should have non-punitive approaches. You should have financial assistance to address incapacity. All these things are on the table as things that would make the treaty work better, right? And there's, I don't know how many people are in the room, maybe 50 or 60 people. There's 50 or 60 great ideas out there, and not one of you has evidence to support it, right? To say, it's worked. I've seen it work in a similar situation. And that's, I think, what we need to do. Because great ideas don't always work. If you have children, you know that. So all these things make sense. But what we want to know, among other things, is which actually work. Do they help a lot or a little? So it would help, but would it help a lot or not very much? And under what conditions will this great thing you have, will states actually agree to it? Because you may have a great idea, but if they don't like it, it doesn't matter. You have a great idea for a carbon tax. Do you really think the US Congress is going to pass a carbon tax anytime in your lifetime? I don't think so. It has that word tax at the end of it, which tends to get in the way. So the research question is, what design features, what things can you put in a treaty that will make them more effective, make them work better? And specifically what we did in this case was try to say, how do we think about that with respect to a particular type of thing that's become more and more common in environmental treaties, which are differentiated obligations. That is to say, do you say everybody cut back 10%? Or do you let people cut back different amounts, from everybody according to their ability to everybody according to their needs, sort of. And if you aren't interested in treaties today, all right, those of you who came here because you're getting extra credit for your class, all right, and you could care less about environmental treaties, treaties are just one example of a policy intervention to alter human behaviors. They're just one way we try to do something to make the world a better place, and we use human institutions to do it, and we want to know whether they work. Everything you do in the world is to make the world closer to your image of it. You intervene, and you hope that the world is better. And the question is that, especially in lots of policy cases, we're not doing experiments. We're not doing the kind of gold standard, manipulate the independent variable and see if the dependent variable comes out different. What we're doing are not even like qualitative experiments, not even natural experiments. We're just grabbing data from the world and seeing how it comes out. But the problem is, the first big thing, which is obvious to anybody who does this kind of research, you have to distinguish what are the policy influences from the other things that are causing people's states' behaviors to change. So if we're looking at climate emissions, we need to know what means emissions go up and down. You can see a big dip in 2009 in climate emissions. What was it due to? The treaty? No, there's this thing called a global economic recession that caused us to make much less stuff, and we therefore made much less pollution. So we have to take account of those. The second is that we want to know what's the active ingredient. Yale is obviously a better university than Harvard, right? We all know that. That's true. But if you were the University of Oregon, what would you take from Yale's superb model to make U of O better? Yes, it would have been to start back in the 1700s and all that stuff. But if you don't have that option, what could you, is being at Yale because they have great admissions and made all you smart when you came here? Is that what's doing the work? Or do they have great faculty? Or do they have great deans? Right, what is making the difference? We need to know what the active ingredient in the treaty is. And the third part is you have to address a fancy thing called endogeneity, which is that treaties are not randomly assigned to problems, and countries are not randomly assigned to treaties. They select in. We design treaties to address problems. So if we see two different treaties, you should start with the assumption that the treaties are different because the problems are different. And therefore, you would expect the behaviors to be different. And likewise, if you see members behaving differently than non-members, the countries that are in the treaty behaving differently than the treaties that aren't, you shouldn't say, wow, that's because of the treaty. You should say, wow, I bet the people who want to change get in, and the people who don't want to change don't. I would not compare people who join Jenny Craig to those who don't to see whether Jenny Craig works. The people who go to Jenny Craig want to lose weight. The people who don't go to Jenny Craig don't, right? At a very fundamental level. So we don't have random assignment to treatment or non-treatment groups. So those are the big issues. And I'm working on in treaties, but if you're working on how to end homelessness or how to help support development in Zimbabwe or whatever your issue is, you're going to intervene in the same way, but in a non-random, non-controlled setting. So to get things started, we have to think about, it's usually good to start with theory, to say what do we already know about the world. And IR scholars think about the effectiveness of treaties in two different ways. There's a bunch of people called realists who claim that treaties never work. How can you say that? Well, they're voluntary. There's nobody to enforce them. Treaties, states only negotiate obligations that require what they would do anyway. And there's lots of theorizing to support this and lots of evidence to support it. And even if they don't, if they negotiate some set of rules that look like really like good rules that would really solve the problem, only the states that want to do it will join. That would be the argument. And I think both of these are true to an extent. So you have to take them seriously. You can't just blow them off as they don't know what they're talking about. What that leads to is a notion that treaties will have high compliance. Countries will follow the rules, but not because of the rules. All right? Those of you who still drive a VW Bug know that you always comply with the speed limit, but it has nothing to do with the speed limit. All right? We all drive the speed limit. When there's 3 feet of snow on the ground, it has nothing to do with the speed limit. So you might have high compliance but low effectiveness. That is, people follow the rules, but it's not because of the rules, it's because of something else. And so that what you have under this realist claim says obligations, the rules, who joins the rules, since they're voluntary joining, and the behaviors go together. They all correlate. They correlate nicely. But it creates the illusion of effectiveness when it's not really effective. The treaty isn't making a difference. It just looks like it is. The fancy word in the IR literature is epiphenomenal. All right? It's an epiphenomenon. There's extensive theorizing about it that has a bunch of reasons to expect this, that treaty obligations are shallow. They don't require countries to do much in the sense of don't require countries to do much other than they would do anyway. They screen rather than constrain. That is to say, they screen out the countries who don't want to follow the rules. You say, hey, everybody wants to follow the rules, join. And if you don't want to follow the rules, you're screened out. So only the countries that wanted to follow the rules join, and therefore it's hard to compare the countries that are members to non-members. And a third implication is that if you really wanted these treaties to make a difference, you'd have to include sanctions, and that never happens anyway. They either aren't incorporated or states don't follow through with them for a variety of reasons we could go into in Q&A. A key thing, and we'll get back to this, is that most of the quantitative studies actually have supported this claim, that you don't find large treaty effects. It's been very hard for the quantitative econometricians to find treaty effects. But I usually put this slide in with like 75-point font, because then you can say, but, and it's a big but. But institutionalists claim the opposite, that treaties sometimes work. Countries don't get together and spend all that time negotiating for nothing. I mean, our politicians may be stupid, but they're not that stupid. So states design treaties to solve problems. And if they must do more than screen. They can't just keep out the countries who don't want to do anything and let in the countries who would do it anyway. It wouldn't solve the problem. That would be silly, right? So states can't do that knowingly, right? I don't believe that treaties are just a little, kabuki play in which it's all mirrors and images and they're not really trying to do things. I think these people sincerely are trying to solve the environmental problems they face. So states negotiate treaties that work through at least 3 mechanisms, and there's more, but this gives you the broad brush. Reciprocal obligations. I might not be willing to do something, but if you are willing and I'm willing, and together we can say, I'll exchange my commitment to reducing climate change gases or reducing hazardous waste trade or anything, and you do the same, we can get somewhere together that we wouldn't get to individually, right? So we can exchange our own pre-treaty unilateralism for post-treaty reciprocity. That may work. Another is we can have linkages. If there's countries who don't want to do something, we pay them. We make it worth their while. I can give you examples of that. There was a fur seal treaty in 1911, and Japanese and Canadians got paid to let their boats rust and not catch seals anymore. And it worked beautifully, right? Just pay people to do things. It tends to work. And you can get normative pressures. You know, human rights are abused all the time in international relations. But I happen to believe they're abused less today than they were 60 years ago when the human rights regimes got started, 60 and 70 years ago, because we just say doing these things is wrong. The current election cycle may lead you to believe that those sorts of norms don't carry much weight, but normative pressures can also work. And there's been extensive theorizing here as well about transparency norms, et cetera, and a lot of evidence here. The empirical evidence here has largely been of a qualitative nature that find states acts in ways that just don't make sense unless you know the treaties there. You can kind of find the fingerprints of the treaties on their behavior. You see states adopting laws that, in fact, incorporate exactly the language of the treaty, right? Other ways you can find ways you can process trace in a qualitative sense and see that these treaties made a difference. So by way of empirical background then, this is like making data up. I've read the literature on qualitative studies in general about environmental treaties. And here's kind of the lay of the land. There's qualitative studies and quantitative studies. And there's single treaty studies and multi-treaty studies. So generally, studies are done about a single treaty. You pick one case and you look at it. You either look at it in a qualitative case, you look at 5 countries and see if they responded to this treaty or not, and see if you can do some deep interviews and find out how the treaty affected their behavior. There's a few quantitative studies as well of single treaties. There's very little work comparing treaties. Now think about that, though. And it's one thing that is what I'm interested in. If you want to know what made one treaty work better than the other, what would you have to do? You'd have to look at least 2 treaties, right? You would have to start with 2 treaties, and yet we haven't done much of that. The other is to notice that, so one is just to say a lot more single treaty studies than multiple treaty studies. And the other is that quantitative studies tend to get negative results, all right? Tend to find no effect. The other thing is just notice that the qualitative studies of multiple cases find some work and some don't. So the institutionalists are not saying treaties always work. They're just saying they sometimes do rather than never do. All right. So that's the state of the research. And I really believe that if you're not doing multi-treaty comparison, it's really hard to identify under what conditions these things work. It's hard to identify the active ingredients. You overgeneralize from single cases. There are really studies of a single treaty, the headline of which is "Treaties are a waste of time." I met one student from Yale who didn't learn anything. Don't go to Yale. That's kind of crazy, right? To take one case and say all treaties don't work because I found one that doesn't. That doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of overgeneralizing in the literature. And if identifying better treaty design is the goal, we need to conduct research to convincingly identify better treaty designs. So the research question is, does including provision X in a treaty make it more effective? How would you know? You should be able to observe states altering their behavior more in response to a treaty that has X than one that doesn't. I mean, this is like straightforward, this is like research design 101, right? You should have a treatment case and a non-treatment case, and observe a difference between them. And how do you do that? But there's 2 big sets of analytic challenges. One is, if you're looking at a single treaty, you have to avoid misinterpreting the better behavior of members when compared to non-members as due to the treaty. So that's one big set of challenges. And the second is that when you're comparing many treaties, you have to avoid misinterpreting the better behavior of the members of one treaty versus the other treaty as due to the better design. So one is, if members behave different than non-members, it might not be due to the treaty. If one treaty does better than the other treaty, it might not be due to the treaty, right? It might do, wow, that treaty faced an easier problem. I'm guessing that some of you will do better in your quantitative or qualitative research methods class than in your quantitative research methods class. It might have less to do with the teaching than with the subject matter. So in the single case, when you're thinking about, so we got to solve 2 problems. How do we make sure we know for each treaty how well it worked, and then how can we compare across them? Those are 2 separate tasks. You got to make sure that members and non-members are otherwise similar, essentially. You've got to exclude alternative explanations. So the first is just to say, we somehow figured out a way to make the countries that got the treatment of being a member equivalent to the countries that didn't. So we have to, there's a variety of alternative explanations. We have alternative explanations for variation across countries, for why we can't compare across countries, so that our observations of the US and our observations of the UK are not comparable, so we can't use them in that way. How do we adjust for that? It's also true that countries face different levels of obligation. What I mean by shallowly obligated is to say, if you have all the countries have to reduce by 10%. That's not going to be equally difficult for all countries. Some countries were on their way to reducing by 10% anyway because they were getting off coal for other reasons, et cetera. And for other countries, they're developing and you're expecting their emissions to go up. For them to reduce by 10% would be very costly. So we have to think about whether countries, what's required of them compared to what they would have done otherwise is hard or easy. Notice that the implication of that is if you think about shallowly obligated states, states that aren't required to do much, those shallowly obligated states are likely to comply, right? Easy for them to comply and has very little to do with the treaty, right? They were going to do it anyway. What we're going to focus on is those deeply obligated states and see if those states change their behavior because they're the ones who, whatever they did, it's not likely due to they're not likely to meet the rules of the treaty on its own. It must be the treaty at work, or it's more likely to be the treaty at work. We also have to deal with change over time, that the same country, there might be things affecting it, non-treaty factors, economic boom, economic bust could change emissions of a given pollutant. And there may be unobserved factors. So that's on the single treaties case. On the multiple treaty case, better outcomes may not be due to a better design. So if we see, as I mentioned before, if we see, we have to try to figure out how do we make sure that problems in treaties are otherwise similar. Kind of hard to do. You think, oh, there's not, we'll get to a slide in a second, that, oh, well, all treaties are unique. Everyone's in its own case. But you can certainly imagine some environmental problems are harder than others. The Montreal Protocol on ozone protection was $1 billion problem. Climate change, $1 trillion problem. Right? It's just going to be harder to move the needle on climate change than on ozone loss. So we have to have, the problems in treaties have to be otherwise similar. We have to have treaties that differ in one important design feature. If our treaties are identical, it's not going to tell us much about what works. We need to have two treaties that address similar problems in similar ways, but differ in something important. Right? It's how you know that actually studying while having a beer works a little less well than studying without the beer. Right? Because you're still the same person studying for the same course. When you have a beer in your hand, you don't study as well as when you do. Or vice versa, whichever kind of person you are, I guess. We also have to think a little bit about the metrics. If you have two treaties, how do you compare which one worked better? You have to have some metrics. Two things I'll point out. One is you have to measure behavior in the same kind of units. And I do that by saying percentage change, right? Percentage year-to-year change. That seems like a reasonable approach. Better than any of the alternatives. We certainly don't want to measure tons of some pollutant compared to tons of a different pollutant, which might be quite different. And we need to use the same equation. We have to account for the other things. So this will make more sense for the econometricians in the room. I'm going to skip over some of this because we'll get back to it. So you're going to say, but each treaty is unique. Are there any really truly comparable treaties? Well, Karen mentioned this database, and so I can actually now say, because I've collected the text of over 1,200 multilateral environmental treaties, and there are lots of unique treaties. The Framework Convention on Climate Change. There's only one climate change treaty to speak of. You know, it's had a protocol and now a new agreement. There's only one biodiversity treaty, one desertification treaty, one Basel treaty on hazardous waste, one wetlands treaty. But there's many clusters of similar treaties. There's about 50 different fisheries treaties, all trying to do fundamentally the same thing, get people to stop fishing so much. There's a bunch of species protection treaties, all of which are trying to ensure the protection of species that are threatened by poaching, et cetera. There's a lot of river pollution treaties. All these address politically similar problems, meaning the incentives to cheat and to comply are pretty similar. They have essentially similar treaties, and they differ in one or a few allegedly important design features. This goes to Mill's method of difference from 250 odd years ago. So this is the treaty universe. This is a database I've created just to give you some sense. Red is amendments, green is protocols, and blue is treaties. Just say, wow. Everybody thinks treaties started here in the 1970s with the Stockholm Conference. There have been environmental treaties for a long time before that. We've had tons since. This may either be the fact that it takes a while for treaties to get into the database, or treaty fatigue, or we've fixed everything. One of those three things. I'm sure it's not the last. So then, as I move to the empirical part, I want to do a pop quiz. So was this treaty effective? Real data. Take a moment to get the graph because it'll come back. Did that treaty work? Hopefully you guys start seeing, yeah, kind of complicated, not straightforward, right? We see that the joiners were already decreasing at a faster rate than the non-joiners before it started. Not sure the rate changed all that much. Got to compare it to the non-joiners. The joiners and the non-joiners aren't the same. Hopefully this makes it like, yeah. Okay, no, I'm going to go do the project I'm working on. It seems easier than what Ron's working on. All right? That should be for each first round. So was this treaty effective? Okay, now that you've figured out that one, was it more effective than this one? And we have less data. This is the real world. We have fewer years because this is a more recent treaty. There's a right answer to this question. No, there's not. It's hard. It's like really hard. I want you guys to feel the, how hard it was, because I've been working this a long time, and it's really hard to sort it out. And I don't think most real policy problems are any different than this, actually. So if you did figure it out, how confident are you? And what explains one's greater effectiveness? Even if you did figure out that one was better, do you know what it is? What was the cause? So here's what we did. We took 5 cases, 4 protocols under a single treaty, the Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution Treaty, 1979 agreement, to reduce acid rain largely in Europe. It's had 8 protocols. There are 4 that are relevant here because they regulate 2 different pollutants, sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides. One of them actually regulates 2. So we have 5 cases. They vary with respect to this thing that's important, whether they have common obligations. Every country is required to do the same thing, reduce by 30% or reduce by 0, or basically stabilize. And these more recent ones developed precisely to improve reductions, right? The reason these are all differentiated later in time is because they were trying to fix these, right? They said, and so we see that here, they range from 11 to 83%, really different obligations, 10 to 90%, 0 to 61. This is just like the climate change agreements. Here, give you some sense of the cases, number of examples, et cetera. And so the specific policy question was, do common obligations work better or less well than differentiated obligations? We know that differentiated obligations generally get more countries to comply because everybody says, how much weight do you want to lose? Raise your hand. We're not going to require anything more than what you care to lose. Well, who wouldn't join that treaty, right? That's what the new Paris Agreement is. Everybody hold up their hand and say how much they're willing to reduce. Now, I don't think it's that bad, because I think if you have to hold up your hand and say you're going to lose weight, it's in a normative context in which everybody says, oh, I'm supposed to lose weight, right? All the countries that are even going to increase their emissions framed and discussed their emission reductions, their INDCs, as reductions, reducing carbon intensity, reducing emissions per dollar, things like that. So there's something to be said for normative pressure. But so if they've increased participation, has there been a trade-off in effectiveness? Have we bought more countries in the agreement at the expense of less change in their behavior? We have an empirical model that models emissions growth rates in these sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, as a function of a bunch of controls which we're really just trying to get off the table. We're not interested in the effects of these things. We're trying to say we've controlled for them. We've taken care of those. We want to deal with the selection effect and say that some states that would face deep obligations under these treaties actually joined. It didn't screen them all out. It didn't say only the countries who have an easy job get to join and the other ones don't. We wanted to test that in some way. And we have to separate membership out from the joiners and the non-joiners. Notice that joiners and non-joiners is different than shallow and deep, right? We wanted to get at the notion that you could join even though you had deep obligations because you got paid or you otherwise were forced to comply, forced to join. And pre-post treaty effects. So, sorry, got ahead of myself. So the treaty effect is just looking at what's the coefficient on membership after we've controlled for everything else. So here's the 5 protocols. So those were the ones I showed you before. So that's kind of conceptually what you're trying to figure out. Did these 3 lower ones work better than those 2? You can think of treaty effects are like medical treatment. We look at the change of joiners and the change of non-joiners, and the difference is the treaty effect, right? This is a standard medical model of whether a drug works or not, just with joiner and non-joiner replaced with, or aspirin or no aspirin replaced with joiner, non-joiner. And we use a different type model. Remember what we're focused on. We don't care about variation across countries. Treaties don't have effects by turning one country into another country. Treaties have an effect by changing one country's behavior in one period into a different behavior in the next period. So we're looking at change over time, and we're going to average that across all countries. We're trying to analyze single treaty effects and compare multiple treaty designs. So hypothesis 1 was merely that members reduce emissions more than non-members. So again, I guess we don't need that one again. I just want to make sure if I'd go on too long, you knew what you're talking about. This is across all members. We just compare members to non-members. And we only find 1 of our 5 cases where, after you've controlled for everything else, members reduce emissions more than non-members, ceteris paribus. And it's not by very much. This is per year. So the dependent variable is annual growth rate in emissions. So this would be 0.6% per year. Over 10 years, that gets you 6% greater reductions. Doesn't seem like very much. Compared to what would have happened otherwise. 4 of our 5 cases, there's no observable effect. 1 case, there's an observable but very small effect. Bummer, right? This is a treaty that's held up usually as, and its protocols as quite effective. The quantitative research hasn't found it. I was hoping to be the one quantitative person who did it right and show you, in fact, these did make a difference. Not so much. So hypothesis 2, what if you take account of the fact that we're not talking about countries that are homogeneous. We're talking about countries that are different. Think about a teacher, right? Should we evaluate a teacher on how well all students learn? Well, there were some kids in the class who are taking it because it's a requirement, and they already knew the stuff. They didn't learn jack, right? But we have the other people who were perhaps the not particularly bright and learned a lot. And if the not particularly bright kids were only 20% of the class, but they learned a lot, and the other 80% were really bright but didn't learn very much, then on average we wouldn't see much learning, would we? Because we're averaging a large effect on a small subset, averaging it across a large group. Well, maybe the treaties only have an effect on the countries that have deep obligations. The shallow obligations are the ones that they're just going to do what was required, but they were going to do that anyway. So that's what we wanted to look at. We did some more other rounds of it, and we still get kind of the same problem. We do have effects, but in different treaties, and depends which treaty, whether you're affecting the states that weren't going to do much otherwise, but they not only did what they were supposed to, but did even more. That's what this says. This says the countries that weren't required to do much, nonetheless, did 5% more than they would have otherwise, after you've adjusted for everything else. And this one says, no, in this case, this treaty had an effect on the countries that weren't likely to do much anyway. That were really the recalcitrant countries, the ones who didn't want to do anything, and they got in and did something different than they would have otherwise. Again, though, this is not compelling evidence. It is, this is like, I am trying to get, wrest some findings out of a thing that's not giving me much findings here. Now, one thing might be, hey, maybe you should conclude these things don't work. right? That may be the core answer. I'm reluctant to do that, and we can talk about that during Q&A. I think it should suggest to you the bias of researchers. I believe in and want to believe that treaties work, and the data doesn't support it. That's the worst kind of research, isn't it? Right? Isn't that everything you've been trained in since your first stats class you shouldn't do? Trust me, once you start doing this stuff, you'll say, oh my God, I'm so not going to get tenure if I don't publish something, and there is no journal that publishes null findings. All right? So, hypothesis 3. You'd almost forgotten. We were trying to do this about policy, weren't we? So we wanted to say, do members reduce emissions more in response to differentiated obligations than common obligations? Are we having to make a trade-off where you get more countries in by having differentiated obligations, but they just got into a treaty that doesn't require anybody to do anything? And again, it's the same thing. We get a little bit of effect that when we compare two treaties, so we're comparing treaties regulating the same pollutants, but one with common and one with differentiated. So we're getting pairs here. So before we had 5 treaties here, we're doing the appropriate pairing. Again, this is a quick once-over. You can read all 40 pages of the article if you want. But we have some effect on shallowly obligated countries, which is actually contrary to what my expectation would be. I would expect the countries that are signing up to do something would not do more than required. Now, it may be that those are the good countries, the positively inclined countries, who once they get in, get reassured and do more, right? But it's a little bit unclear to me how we make sense of this. So what are the take-home messages? One is just the empirical point. We've done 5 analyses of 4 protocols, and most are not effective, but some are. It would be nice to tease out why to get a little better sense of that, but we haven't gotten there yet. And differentiated obligations don't have an observably big effect like we would hope. We would hope that they would make a big effect that we could really see. I think the real take-home is treaties may work, but it's really hard to show it, at least in a quantitative way, right? You know, I've got to believe that my parenting makes a difference for my kid, but God help me if you ever get any evidence to support that, right? You know, it's just, there's things we know we believe are true, and we can't find the evidence, right? And the question is whether that lack of evidence is because it's hard to get the evidence or because it's just simply not, that I'm actually not making any difference and I'm just making my kids worse off, right? Well, actually, but even making my kids worse off would be an effect. Might not be the one intended, but it would be an effect. So we have to think about, maybe it's just that treaties may work, but it's really hard to show it. And that's scary. When we face climate problems like climate change, like acid rain, like species loss, all those things, really, we can't guide policymakers by saying, hey, just do this, and we have evidence to support that? And at least my read of the literature is there's very little evidence. People have great ideas and great theories, and I have examples till the cows come home of great theories that have screwed stuff up. You want to know how to kill off all the langur monkeys in Vietnam? Create a protected area. That is like putting a sign around and saying, poachers, langur monkeys here, which is actually what happened, right? So there's lots of cases where good intentions do a very good paving job. Third is to identify treaty. So I think a third takeaway is that to identify treaty or any policy designs that work better, you got to compare them. So as you go off to do your research on whether this NGO you're working for could do a better job, compare 2 NGOs that are similar to your NGO, one of which has a new fundraiser and one of which doesn't. See if it makes a difference. And that's hard to do. And the other is just this notion of that if you want compelling answers, you've got to overcome a bunch of within and between case research problems, right? So that's throwing a lot at you. I hope it leads, I've left 15, 20 minutes for questions, and I hope some of them are challenging ones. I'll want to say thank you for using what you learn at Yale to save the planet, because we need it. There is a lot of work to be done, and part of the way it will get done is by people who are smarter than me, solving these problems better than I do, and then going out there and saying, here's what we need to do. Let's stop doing treaties. After 10 more years after Dr. Mitchell's scintillating presentation back in 2016, we did research and we found there's not a single treaty in the known universe that's ever made any difference in behavior. Let's start funding NGOs. That would be progress, because we spend a lot of time funding people to fly to Geneva for treaty negotiations, right? So we need to know what works and what doesn't, and it's a hard question. So I'll leave it there, and I will welcome your challenging and attacking and vicious questions.
A couple of microphones, questions, comments.
I would think that more treaties might be entered into, and there'd be more compliance of those treaties if there were considerable public buy-in. First question is that true? And second question is, how do you get more and significant public buy-in?
Great question, and indeed, I would love if somebody could tell me whether it's true or not. That's, in fact, part of my point is saying, people haven't done that. It said, hey, let's find two treaties that look pretty similar, one of which had good public buy-in and one of which didn't. So the first thing is to say, that'd be great. The second is public buy-in is not randomly assigned. That is, you're not going to be able to get one treaty that's just like the other but has more public buy-in. It's going to have to be different to get that buy-in. So that, therefore, they aren't the same. That is, we might get more public buy-in. We had a lot of public, I don't know if it's buy-in, I don't know if it meet your definition, a lot of public buy-in on the whaling treaty, meaning a lot of concern about it. But, I don't know, Norway, for example, has disregarded the moratorium on commercial whaling for years. Still get whale burgers in Oslo any day you want. So now, is that still less than it would have been otherwise? Perhaps. So those are the kinds of questions that's the right question, and I don't have the answer. But I think two things. One is to say we do need to do research. We can't just go with our theory. And the second is that the research has to face this endogeneity problem, the fact that treatment, that public concern is not randomly assigned, that the treaties we get in areas of public concern are going to be quite different than the ones we don't, right? They're going to be more ambitious, et cetera. You know, the reason why the Paris Agreement is stronger than the Kyoto Protocol and is stronger than the original 1992 Framework Convention is because there's been more public buy-in. Right, and so it's not. So we don't want to compare the Paris Agreement to the Framework Convention, because they're really completely different treaties under completely different circumstances. Yeah.
That goes to my question. My name is Marian Churcho, and what I wanted to ask is, it seems that you're under representing the complexity, and B,
that would be. I don't think anybody else in the room would agree. But
the value of the treaties, because just what you said, you know, that framework convention set the stage for the next one, for Kyoto, set the stage for, and we don't know what causes these influences. I'm sure we can both remember the Montreal Protocol, and kids at school would make these dumb jokes like, oh, you're depleting the ozone layer, ha, 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 without any connection necessarily to the specifics of that remark, or knowing that it was maybe in the air because of the Montreal Protocol. So I appreciate your allegiance to the methodology, and that was your message to us today, and it was a great message, but but I think it's causing us to undervalue the efforts that go into these treaties that also raise awareness, that also create buy-in, and so forth.
First of all, I know your work, so it's nice to have you in the room. Thank you. And I guess I would say I agree. That is, I agree with the notion that the world is more complex. There's a lot of complex ways in which these may work. And I think what we want to be careful of, though, is a little bit the notion that is to recognize our biases. That our biases lead us, when we don't find an effect one place, we look for it somewhere else. That is, I am quite confident that Harvard does not want to find out that if they took, I mean, this is not true about Yale, of course, but that Harvard does not want to find out, does not want anybody to do a study that finds out any university in the country that got all of the valedictorians and salutatorians from every high school in the country would have people who make 300 grand a year the rest of their lives anyway if you just brought them together for 4 years or just mail order them a degree from your university, right? It may not be that Harvard makes a difference. They just have great admissions officers. So, and they're not in the business of saying, wait, what are we doing? They want to believe. I want to believe my parenting helps. You know, maybe not, right? And I have skin in that game. You know, I have psycho-emotional skin in, not in getting my kids to turn out well, but in believing that I am. And I'm not going to be a good evaluator that my parenting is working. That is not to say that the world isn't complex. And I really believe, like, the case I think it really works is human rights. I don't think you could ever show that human rights have gotten better because of the treaties. But I fundamentally believe it's true. Right? Because it's hard because people are caring more about human rights for all sorts of reasons that are not treaty reasons either. So it's hard to you know, take the warp and woof and get the yarn back out, right? So I'm sympathetic to what you're saying, and I want to be cautious in saying we have to do both. I think it's good.
Hi, I'm Kevin. I'm a second-year master student here. On a related note, I'm wondering if you've evaluated the effectiveness of treaties in conjunction with other policies, either related or unrelated.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to like understand the scope, I think,
Sure.
of your work.
I think that's where, like, so my dissertation a quarter century ago was on oil pollution. And what you can really show there is under a set of circumstances where, in fact, intentional oil pollution, cleaning out your tanks from oil and dumping it overboard, that reduced, and there's really no other explanation than international law. And I selected that case precisely because it's a case where, in fact, I had good methodologists training me in how to select a case. And it's select the hardest case you can, where international law is least likely to make a difference. Why would you do that? That's kind of setting yourself up for failure. No, because if it is setting myself up for failure, but it's saying, if I can show that international law makes a difference where it's least likely to make a difference, then it also makes a difference somewhere else. So I said, who's a powerful actor who I would expect not to be responsive to international law? I said, yeah, I'm thinking oil companies are pretty far up there in that list. Did we get them to change the way they ship oil around the world? And we did, and we got them to buy different ships that were more expensive, right? And they would not have bought them otherwise. They did it right as the other pressures for reducing oil pollution were actually decreasing, not increasing. So they were likely to move in the other direction. But it was much more of a process tracing thing. And notably, I haven't decided to go collect the data to do that quantitatively because I would hate to, like, I don't mind undercutting other people's research, but undercutting my own research is, I'm not even, you know, that dumb, right? So I think but there's a lot of other people who are doing this stuff. Although, but to your point, was it Kevin? That, in fact, the great thing is, and part of my creating this database is so people like you and PhD students, there's a lot more places where work can be done. And everybody's focusing on 3 or 4 treaties. But there's so many out there that so much great work could be done, but everybody thinks, oh, it's too hard to get the data. Because they don't want to bother, because they can't find it on the first page of Google results. Well, I'm sorry, that doesn't cut it. Deep dissertation work is going out and just digging in and saying, here's how I'm going to collect data and cobble it together and make something that I can actually analyze in a useful way, at the risk of coming up with no findings. So it's a risky business. Other questions? Yeah, your name?
Hi, my name's Dan, first year PhD. I'm wondering, in light of that response you just gave, how much do you think the kind of fact that a lot of the quantitative studies have null findings just has to do with not having the right data or not being able to specify models correctly?
I think one is when you look at the data, some of them are using it by really, you know, highfalutin, well pedigreed, well-respected scholars are doing, and you look at the data, you know, you scratch the surface a little bit and say, oh my God, really? You do. I mean, you can see studies of whether a treaty made a difference that are cross-sectional studies. Like, fundamentally doesn't work, right? We don't expect treaties to have an effect across countries. It's over, you know, it's over time. So there's not excellent data in a lot of cases, but I think it can be created. I mean, to take a perfect example, there's 50 fisheries treaties. The FAO has quite good data on fish catch of every species in every quadrant of the oceans over the last 60, 70 years. You could do it. I'm planning on doing it. So one part is, yeah, there is lots of quantitative studies done with bad data, and there's good data out there for a fair number of them. So that problem's solvable. The econometric modeling is also more challenging, and that was part of what we were trying to do here, is get past some things like saying, well, members are just different than non-members. Well, you should be able to test that, right? You shouldn't just take that as a given and then throw up your hands and say it doesn't work. You should be able to get data and think about how to model it properly. That my worry is that, I did this work with Glenn Dean, who I put on the first slide, who's a statistician, and we did our best to capture that, and and at the end of the day, the reason I don't think we did a good job is because we got null findings. I actually think the model's right, and I should therefore trust the findings, which are no, these don't work, right? So what I would like is people to say, no, this is what's wrong with your modeling, and then poof, we now have positive findings. I get published in 3 articles, and the New York Times calls me up. That would be good. But so I think, yeah, the thing is, when you get null findings, is trying to figure out why they are there. If you have positive findings, you never worry about that. You never worry that your modeling also might be wrong, and it might be bad data, right? Bad data and a bad model can lead to positive findings just as readily as null findings. But people never question it.
Thank you for that presentation. My name is Michael Mendez. I'm a Pinchot faculty fellow here. I have 2 questions. In terms of the metrics or your analysis, do you factor in for other issues that are not looking for just direct emissions reductions, but looking like co-benefits and how different nation states are factoring that in as a success? And then 2, is your research expanding and looking at subnational governments in terms of their treaties or their MOUs that they're creating?
Yeah. No, in terms of the co-benefits, it's a good question. I don't know in the case of acid rain. I guess there might be co-benefits in terms of less building destruction, fewer lakes being, destroyed. We probably control for that a little bit by, our country, by the way we set up the model, but not explicitly at all. So those are ones where, yeah, you'd have to go to the next layer. And the same thing with the national and subnational, right? It'd be hard to see American, like in the climate change case, American national policy hasn't changed at all in response to Kyoto, but certainly California, Oregon, Washington, the RGGI, there's been lots of changes at the subnational level. And that's a space that a lot of people are moving into, which I think is great because that's a lot of where the action is. And it's where the action for climate change, for my money, that's where it's got to be, right? It's not going to be a top-down system. It has to be a top-down and bottom-up. So.
Would that have occurred if the treaties didn't exist? Would these subnational governments be acting in absence of federal action?
No, actually, I'm doing some other work that actually I think you're exactly right, which is that I think it works in this way of saying, here's the way things should be. Right, that it says bad behavior, what climate change did, which you can really see now 20 years later, in the way that Marion was talking about, right, is to say 20 years ago you could say we don't care about climate change. Today you can't. You might still believe it, right, but you can't say it. You have to say I've got to work the climate change problem. And that normative sense of what these treaties do is say here's bad behavior and here's good behavior. And that then creates a normative sense that you guys, as environmentalists, call up your state legislator and say, damn it, we need a state-level, renewable portfolio standard. And so it says, here are good things in the world. And then people point to them in what's called the boomerang effect in political science by Mimi Keck and Catherine Sickink, of saying, you create laws, domestic actors, you create laws, countries join them, and domestic actors in those countries then hold their governments to those laws. This is how you get human rights compliance. And so I think there's a lot more action at that level. To be honest, it's never a level I've been interested in working at, and what I need to do is coordinate, cooperate and co-author with people who are. Because that may be where the action is. Again, I think we have to be careful about when we don't find some effectiveness where we think it is, then look somewhere else. That's a little bit moving the goalpost that I get uncomfortable with. But it might be still the truth. So I think that's what we have to balance. Yes.
I think maybe related to Michael's question, if you start with something that you observed has happened, so in Europe, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide is not in the air anymore. Right. And he asked the question, what led to that change? So you at least don't have the argument, was there a change or not?
Right.
And if you then start with your now conclusion, actually the treaties didn't make any difference, right? Which you don't want to believe, but
right.
That's what the thing. Then can you work that story back? Like what actually did cause changes? And you might come, if you were with all your things, to the conclusion, I can explain all of this, except I can't explain this part. So now maybe that's the signal that treaties are effective. But we have the ozone.
Right,
we have some observable. So we start with the observable change, not whether treaties cause the change. Start with the change, and then try and tease out all the different, like the depression after 2009. All these things are going to affect change. I'm wondering how the story works out then.
Yeah, that might be an interesting next step to say we tried a drug, we didn't see an effect on the patient. Let's back up and say the patient looks healthier, and now say why did that happen, and try to tease out what that is and find something whether the drug did make an effect that was a little more complicated or interlaced.
Hypothesis that the treaty sets a norm, but then the laws that get put in or the economics that get put in actually makes a change. The treaties didn't really make a change, but it got people to figure out how to do things that they could do.
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, that's where all this stuff. I mean, part of the thing is we also don't have a good sort of typology of mechanisms of how do these things work. You know, I've been working on that. Some other people are working on how do you lay out. Here's the ways this could work. Here are the 6 ways a treaty can work. And if you have that, then you can sort of start working through. Yeah, well, this one didn't work. No money exchanged hands, so it couldn't have been economic. You know, but the norms were created, and we can see the fingerprints of those norms in documents and in rallies or whatever. We can see the norms working. We can see, no, there was no enforcement, so it couldn't have been enforcement. So we have some cases. And I think it's important to realize that there are success cases. The 1911 fur seal case is a beautiful case of the standard tragedy of the commons, 4 countries overfishing fur seals. The Russians and the Americans pay off the Japanese and Canadians to stop. They, in fact, wholly stop fur sealing for about 5 years. The stocks recover, and the American government takes in more and more money every year after 1916 because they actually solved the problem. Because they're killing more seals and paying the tax to the federal government for every seal they kill at a far higher rate than they were before. And you really see this, wow, this is great. You had 4 countries overusing a resource. The 2 with the most power pay off the 2 with the least power to let their boast rest. And we solved the problem. That's cool. You know, that's a cool solution, and it's not reciprocity. Yes, all 4 countries should have cut back. Wasn't going to happen. So you said, is there another solution than reciprocity, than, you know, the standard tragedy commons solution? No. Let's buy people off. Let's privatize it. So I think the important thing to not take away is overgeneralizing that treaties don't work here. These 5 didn't. There's 5 people at Yale in your program who won't learn a damn thing. But the rest of you will. We should not take those 5 people and say Yale doesn't help, right? We want to look, on average, we have to do a lot more research. If we study all of you and you find none of you learn anything, then we've got to start having a conversation, right? But finding a few people who don't learn at a university, oh my God. Or finding a few treaties that don't work? Really? You're going to generalize from that? That seems silly. So I think we want to, and there's lots of success stories as well.
All right, on that positive note. That's right.
The one positive note.
That's right. Well, please join me in thanking Ron. Thanks. I always have parents. Oh, you have to turn off your light.